My name is Danielle Preziuso, and I'm a systems engineer at PNNL. And today I'm happy to share with you some thoughts about designing and deploying place-based renewable energy infrastructure at scale. So I'm sad I can't be with you all in person today, but happy to be here remotely. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So these ideas that I'll present to you today draw from a white paper that we published a couple months ago. It was a great collaboration between researchers at PNNL, the University of Oregon, the University of Arizona, and the University of Pennsylvania. And what our group did here, we were just kind of this group of energy futurists coming together to try to think more broadly about the needs of the future energy system. And what we did was built on some work from our academic partners who are landscape architects, where they were thinking about the role of design in the future energy system. So today, I'll start off by talking about some opportunities and challenges in the existing energy system and the promise of place-based infrastructure as we move forward. Then I'll present 6 different design pathways that we came up with for deploying place-based infrastructure at scale, before wrapping up with some historical lessons and looking to the future a little bit in this space. So the opportunity that we see right now in the energy system is a changing energy system. We have policies and initiatives that are evolving every day, more commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, commitments to creating a more just energy future, like the Justice 40 initiative at the federal level, as well as local policies and initiatives too. At the same time, the technologies that we'll use to fulfill those policies are advancing. We're seeing increased deployment of renewable energy technologies, as well as declining costs to deploy them. And they're being deployed in more innovative market spaces as well. And then on our demand side, of course, we're seeing increased technology adoption there and an evolution in end use behaviors, control technologies, smart thermostats, everything is sort of evolving. So as GP said in the beginning, it's a great opportunity to come together to have this larger discussion about this opportunity, because what all of these different pieces are doing, they're pushing us towards a just energy transition. They're pushing us towards a future where we have an energy system that's accessible, affordable, and sustainable for all who use it. But we need to be intentional about how we get there. So here comes our challenge piece, right? As we develop and deploy renewable energy technologies, we almost see this dichotomy that's perceived and it's sometimes very real between top-down and bottom-up approaches, which we can see on either side of this image here. We know that we have an option to develop in community and place-based approaches that really focus on the individuals in the community. And that can sometimes come into tension with these larger initiatives for scaled, urgent, and national deployment. So the way that we develop these tensions and these challenges arise from unstructured and optional early stage activities in those processes to the historical pass-through of regulatory requirements with which we've traditionally relied on, the effects that come from our infrastructure development. So locally, we might see a change in property values, the tax base, maybe our workforce. But those effects have system-wide values as well, right? So renewable energy infrastructure might affect local ecosystems, perhaps in a negative way, but it's still providing a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So how are we reconciling those different effects? We know that our infrastructure carries different attributes, some that are compensated and some that aren't. Historically, we've tried to leverage as much of those compensated values, developing in locations where interconnection is easy, where there are favorable incentive and policy environments so that we can maximize our profits. And often our uncompensated values have been seen as secondary or a local challenge, right? How do we recognize cultural significance in land or promote social value from that infrastructure? And then finally, the way our projects are developed, we can develop in ways that are more holistic, local paradigms that think about the system as a unit, rather than sort of this natural market diffusion that we often see happening, right? So going back to efficiencies of cost and allowing a lot of the decisions to be made at the consumer or individual level. So, the way this is shown on the slide, it sort of shows opposite tensions or challenges, but we don't see these as a stalemate. We sort of see these as an opportunity for innovation, because if we are going to develop a clean future energy system, we need social equity and environmental equity to be at the heart of that system. So we see this notion of creating synergy between the tensions really as a driving force here. So with that, our work here was trying to create synergy between those tensions and to meet this moment. And we did this by thinking about what that low carbon system might look like in the future. We know that we're going to see renewable energy infrastructure sort of change our current landscape. So we came up with this idea of a renewable energy landscape where that land has been significantly transformed by renewable energy infrastructure. And if we're going to reach a low carbon future, that's a reality. So we are proposing that to develop those landscapes successfully, we need to do so in a way that is place-based and allows for replicability. So we propose this idea of place-based at scale. So balancing the ability to replicate energy infrastructure development with careful attention to unique local character of specific places. So we can think about these ideas across the landscape transect. In the image here, we can think about different resources that might be relevant across rural areas, urban areas, and coastal areas, and the different needs that those communities might have, the different resources that they have access to, and integrating across those to do so in a way that we can replicate across the country. We don't want to come up with solutions that are singular. We want to make this available at scale. So to do this, we envision 6 different pathways. The first is multifunctionality of our infrastructure. We have natural capital, generating local value, decentralization, resilience to climate disruption, and energy justice. So what we tried to do with these pathways is to try to look across different disciplines and envision unique and distinct pathways, but that pathways that are highly interconnected, right? Many of these ideas play on one another, so we can explore them individually, but know that in practice that there is a lot of overlap, and to successfully develop a project under one pathway is very likely going to rely on concepts within other pathways as well. So my hope here is to just take the next couple minutes to outline what we are imagining under each of these different pathways. So our first multifunctionality pathway revolves around this idea that we can co-locate renewable energy technologies with other technologies and different land uses. So again, historically, we have often, very often, tried to develop for generation efficiency. Where can we maximize our production with renewable energy? But renewable energy technologies can have a very large footprint. So when we're thinking about at-scale development, this idea of land use efficiency becomes more and more critical. So we might see some trade-offs here between generation efficiency and land use efficiency. And a lot of these trade-offs will likely be driven by the type of site. So again, that landscape transect serves as a great touch point here, whether it's a coastal, rural, or urban community, and the type of renewable energy infrastructure that we're trying to develop. So agrivoltaics, as you can see in the image there, one idea of how to site PV alongside a farm. But under this pathway, we know that existing land use regulations could be a hurdle here. Many of the regulations only permit for one type of land use, so we kind of see that as a potential obstacle when developing under this pathway. The second pathway here is our natural capital pathway, where we're trying to leverage natural resources that generate the ecosystems on which communities depend to sort of create different societal and economic benefits. So we can look at ecosystem services assessment to try to understand what this might look like. I think we all know that infrastructure development can have negative impacts on local ecosystems, but frameworks that exist for ecosystem service assessment might allow us to look for the positive effects as well. How can we positively affect ecosystems and the benefits that they contribute to society? And we see this as an opportunity to help meet different community objectives that serve both the local people and nature. So one example we might think about under this pathway is developing PV modules such that they support pollinator habitats. And if we can increase the productivity of those pollinator-dependent agricultural products, then we subsequently improve revenue as well. So trying to think innovatively about how we can leverage our natural resources in a more positive way. Our next pathway here is our local value pathway, in which we're trying to deploy projects to respond to the needs and goals of local communities and landscapes. Historically, with our centralized plants, most of that value reached end users that were at a further distance than that local community itself. So in order to develop and design projects under this pathway, we need to look to new stakeholders and create sustained partnerships. Our existing community engagement practices might not be sufficient here, because if we're going to generate local value, we really need to have a strong understanding of what local goals are, challenges, and their values at large. And this is critical because some of those, while historically most value from energy projects that has been derived as monetary, some of this new value might be non-monetary. So how do we reconcile any of those differences that might come up? One idea here is to create more accessible infrastructure. The image shows a solar canopy at a parking facility, but other examples of creating shade in the Southwest with solar canopies along sidewalks is also a way to create more local value that might not be monetary, but it does serve local populations in that way, while still deriving monetary value from those attributes of the system that are compensated, like energy production. Our next pathway here is our decentralization pathway. So again, thinking about that transition from our large centralized plants to smaller distributed energy resources that are located closer to where that energy is actually consumed. So of course, we've seen increased adoption of rooftop PV and other DERs, but this pathway is really trying to think about how we can better integrate those technologies into communities and their built environments. We don't just want those technologies to exist there, but for those technologies and the accompanying infrastructure to be something that communities actually want nearby and in their community. So maybe that's something like building integrated PV or co-locating a small wind turbine with a farm, really thinking about that local landscape and what's beneficial for the end users at that location, and then designing accordingly. Our next pathway here is our resilience to climate change pathway, where we try to address community vulnerabilities that arise from climate-driven extreme weather events. I think all of us at this point are very familiar with the hardship that comes along with extreme weather events and what that can mean for our electric grid. So we're trying to think about ways that we might be able to mitigate blackouts and loss of critical services like water, heating, cooling, in those different types of situations. So we might think about designing and deploying resilience hubs and microgrids. And while some of these other pathways that we focused on so far really targeted the generation side, this idea really requires a diverse set of energy technologies as well as demand side management practices, trying to balance that supply and demand, particularly in the threat of extreme weather conditions. And then our last pathway here is energy justice. So while we frame up this idea of moving towards a future just energy system, we recognize that deliberate effort is needed under this pathway as well. So we're thinking about how we can design and develop to fairly distribute costs and benefits that our energy system creates, while still enabling impartial decision-making and equitable participation in this energy system. So this might mean sensitive energy development and thoughtful decommissioning of existing projects, And this also means that we need to counter legacies of harm. Our energy system has offered many things since its inception, many benefits, but we know that it has disproportionately burdened communities of color, low-income communities, and frontline communities. So how can we prioritize development in communities that do face disproportionate energy insecurity or energy burden, for example? We again recognize that this is not one size fits all and requires an understanding of historical and cultural context, really putting communities at the center of their own energy transitions. So these pathways sort of offer us an opportunity to think past the incremental approach that we've often taken to development, and to think about how we can leverage this opportunity for innovation right now to really transform our energy infrastructure. So trying to really imagine that we're at this spot where it's not just about the next development, but it's about what we envision for the future. So to do that, we can look to history for some lessons, both for things that have, are great learning points, for things we might try to replicate, as well as things that we might try to avoid as well. So, one idea for trying to achieve multifunctionality might be through increased, appropriate, and controlled public access to technologies. For example, we can think back to the New Deal era with the Tennessee Valley Authority, their system of dams. Those dams offered, of course, power generation, but they also offered better flood control, better forest management, reservoirs. So these different purposes through the infrastructure development in a way that was appropriate and controlled for those places. And with that same example, through the New Deal era dams, we can think about enhancing natural and cultural landscape features through the way we site our infrastructure and where we place them. Approaching some of these dams that were built so many years ago, you're just sort of humbled by the size, right? That scale between infrastructure and human. So perhaps those are some things we can try to leverage as we continue to design and deploy. But again, sticking with that example of those dams, we really, really need to focus and give deliberate attention to eliminating exclusionary, unequal, and prejudiced energy practices. Many Native American communities, for example, were displaced by dam flooding. So we have both things that we can try to replicate, but also ways or opportunities on which we know we need to do better, especially as social equity and environmental equity are at the heart of a future clean energy system. So just a couple final thoughts for you here. As we came up with these different pathways, our goal was to really bring forward this idea that the infrastructure that we develop really leaves a legacy over time and space. For what we build is not just for this moment, but is likely to exist for generations to come. So how can we transform our energy system to better enable people, animals, industry, and environment to thrive alongside one another? So really trying to provide some avenues for innovation to address that question. And we argue that now is the time for that innovation, going back to that energy moment of these different pieces coming together. Trying to better think about how our existing landscapes intersect with renewable energy infrastructure and the loads that they serve, because those are inherently connected. So moving forward with this project, we see a great opportunity to try to quantify some of the benefits under the 6 pathways that I shared with you today, with the end goal of trying to innovate policies incentives to include some of the non-traditional benefits, going back to those attributes that are either compensated or uncompensated. We know that the cost of projects really informs development decisions. So if we can invent or innovate policies and incentives that better reflect some of these attributes that currently are not monetized, perhaps we are putting ourselves on a better path towards the future we want to see. And we also see an opportunity to test these pathways in practice. We've come up conceptually with these ideas, but communities are already in their energy transition. So can we apply these in some spaces and reflect on what's successful and what might need some revision? And then something that's just a little more tangible that I'd love to invite you all to are 2 different virtual regional workshops coming up, hosted by our academic partners at University of Arizona and University of Oregon in January of this upcoming year, where we're going to bring together landscape architects and energy professionals to think about how we can design deployments to respond to regional needs in both of these areas. So if you're interested in those, please reach out to me directly, or you can find more information on our website as well. And then just thank you all for having me. And again, this was part of a much larger team effort to just acknowledge my collaborators here. And I'm happy to take questions. Okay.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And so, because she won't be able to join us for the panel discussion at the end of all the presentations. So for her presentation now is open for questions. So any questions? Yes.
I could hear a little bit. Do you mind repeating it?
Yeah, so the question is about decentralization of the solution. So, and the question asked is, for the emerging some of the technology, how do you visualize that and can be integrated into this decentralization platform? Is that a question?
Yeah, and solar probably easy to decentralize. How do the other technologies?
Yeah, so the example here is solar is easy for decentralization, but for example, windmill maybe is harder. So when there are other available technology, how do you view they can be integrated into that platform? Say someone has like a fuel cells, portable, and recent news, they are portable nuclear reactor. I don't know. That's what news say, right? So I'm just give one or two examples, say, because we are so innovative and there will be more and more decentralized solution available. So what is your vision to integrate them into the platform?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that that sort of speaks to the heart of this work too, is trying to think about ways that our technologies can sort of respond to local landscapes. So of course, like you mentioned, PV is very easily adaptable to different locations, but thinking about small wind, for example, it's very often well suited for rural communities, but how can we fold that in a way that is more appropriate? So I think there's a little bit of this effort to identify strong market spaces for different technologies that can both respond to those local needs, as well as create some new value streams that might not have existed otherwise. And I think the other important piece here is that we're thinking about at-scale deployment, and we're thinking about a low carbon or zero carbon energy future. So there's also this step here where we might not be developing the strongest resources, or we might not be putting our technologies always in places that are most efficient. So we have these trade-offs that I think we'll have to make. Some of them will be easier to make than others.
Any other questions? I have a question, very, very interesting for this presentation about integration of renewable energy into the system. And for most of us are consumers, and our use of energy is really very dynamic situations. So how do you match available renewable energy to the demand side? Otherwise, we may have a lot of additional energy and we could not really utilize it and may end up with unstable scenario from the grid point of view. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, I think as always, it's space for innovation. We can think about trying to correlate, of course, different renewable sources, both with one another to create complementarity among themselves, but then also with the grid as well. So I think there's a little bit of effort there, matching resources to demand. But then, of course, controls as well can help us with that. and the easy scapegoat of throwing storage in there can support those efforts as well. But I think it does take a little bit of examination of existing loads and comparing those two local resources that we think we can develop.
Thank you.